an article with us and was an associate and a tax partner, and then the office managing partner for us. She recently took the position as CEO of the Certified Professional Accountants Association of BC. She is also the current chair of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. One of the things, I chair a government agency in addition to my day job. One of the things I know is there's a huge drive for diversity on senior boards. If you read the rest of Lauri's resume, which I won't put to you, you'll see that there's enormous demand for women in government positions at universities and so forth on the board to create that. I can't think of a more ideal candidate. Lauri.
We're live.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you all for inviting me here today. It's such a privilege. And just hearing the speakers before me made me really appreciate the impact of all the different initiatives that your group is doing, either individually or collectively. So congratulations. So my presentation today is going to feature some information that is really hot off the press. We do each year what's called the BC Checkup, and it contains information respecting our BC economy. We'll also go through a survey that we do each year of our members that really assesses their view in terms of how the economy will perform going forward. And I'll finish up by talking about some of the initiatives that we're undertaking really to further the profession and also more broadly to help the economy here in BC. So just starting off with the BC Checkup, this is an annual report that we do that compares performance in BC against Canadian performance, performance in Alberta and Ontario across a number of different metrics classified into 3 buckets: work, live, and invest, and really assesses how as a province we are performing. But before we get into that, let me just talk about where we are generally in terms of economic growth. So the forecast for this year, for 2018, just released 2.4%, down from last year, which had a high of 3.9% growth in GDP. So again, we're resilient, we're carrying along, but we are more dampened from last year. A couple of reasons. One, housing activity. We're seeing a drop in terms of resales, which I know the realtors in the room will have felt already, although new housing starts has remained constant. We're also seeing this impacted because of policy, tightening of interest rates and lending restrictions. Trade relations is also affecting confidence and our ability to really get goods to market, and really underlined by the uncertainty we have around NAFTA, whether or not the free trade agreement might kick in if we can't come to ground on NAFTA, and of course the threat of tariffs both here and what we see happening more broadly. And the third factor really driving this is tax and policy. And this is the first time for about 10 years that we've seen the business tax rates in Canada be higher than in the US. Historically, Canada has enjoyed about 13% benefit or lower rate in terms of the business tax rate. But now with the various initiatives in the US, we are charging people more in terms of tax, and that's certainly affecting confidence. So let's dive into some more detailed metrics. The first ones are around work and dealing specifically with employment opportunities. So let's say the workforce here is buoyant. We're now increased to almost 2.5 million positions. But I would say we are at full capacity and perhaps even nearing labor scarcity conditions. Unemployment is now 5.1%, which is a rate that sees most people who want positions and are actively seeking positions being able to find them. So that 5.1% really reflects people who are transitioning between positions more than people who just simply can't find them. So we are very much approaching labor scarcity, and I'm sure anecdotally we'll hear stories about businesses closing simply because they can't find people to work there. We're also seeing now a real increase in terms of the labor force participation rate. And these are the people between the ages of 60 and 64 who are actively employed or seeking employment. And that has increased up now to 65.3%. and really reflecting the number of opportunities there are in the market. Now, also on workforce, we look not only at opportunities, we also look at labor productivity and how well engaged people are, how employed people are they underemployed, or how well are they doing. So what we see here is an increase to 71.4% of educational attainment. And what that means is the number of people who are employed who have at least some post-secondary education. So this means that people, more likely than not, are in positions that will support their skills, and that shows that the positions are more and more attractive. So that's good news. That said, we're seeing a decline in employment in the sciences, which obviously are in the knowledge-based industries. So that's of concern to see that drop, and that number of 6.8% is well below the national average. So that's of concern. And even more concern is the average compensation amount, which is now at $55,000. That is by far the lowest in terms of the markets we're looking at, Alberta, Ontario, and nationally in Canada, by far the lowest. So reflecting, the existing conditions, but also we have to remember that could change given the labor scarcity conditions that we're seeing coming up. So now we're going to move on to life, quality of life. And so we have seen work, now life. Consumer debt is again concerning at $67,000 per capita, debt per capita, and that is the highest in Canada, and really reflects difficult conditions to live in, given low salaries, the high consumer debt rate. Obviously, housing affordability is a massive issue, and we're seeing there 80.6% in terms of the ratio between the median cost of housing against the median income to support those housing costs. And that by far exceeds the other markets that we see in Canada. But one somewhat bright light is the youth at risk number. And this number measures the number of people who are don't have any high school education who are in the workforce. And that number is going lower, which means that people are getting more education before they enter the workforce, which shows promise. It shows they should have more opportunities in the future. So we've talked about work, we've talked about life. Let's go on to invest. And here we're seeing, again, more red flags. In terms of the private sector, non-residential building investment number, this number has really declined. It's now down to $4.5 billion, down 2.6% from last year, which really reflects the uncertainty that British Columbians have in terms of the economy, and also outsiders, how confident they are in BC as a place to invest. So that number is concerning. We're also seeing a very low number for export value per worker at only $17,000, which is much lower than our comparators across the country. That said, BC is still showing up as strongly based in terms of our overall economic funding model. The government net debt as a percentage of GDP is at 15.2%, which is one of the best in Canada. So mixed messages, I can say that we're resilient. We have a softening in terms of the market from last year, but we are still projecting decent GDP for this year. So I'm going to go now on to the Business Outlook Survey. So that is the hard data. Let's look at some of the perceptions that CPAs have shared with us in terms of how they think the economy will perform. So CPAs are somewhat less optimistic than they were last year. 1/2 of CPAs feel that BC's economy will stay the same. 30% think that the economy will worsen, and only 17% think that the economy will get better. And that is very much lower numbers than we saw last year. That said, on a relative basis, it is better. If you compare people's perceptions in terms of how BC will perform compared to how Canada will perform more broadly, it's more promising relatively. So we're relatively optimistic. 1/4 of CPAs feel that BC's economy will grow faster than the Canadian average, which is roughly similar to how CPAs felt last year. So CPAs were also asked to provide an indication as to their biggest challenges for business success. And no big surprise, the number one challenge was the ability to attract and retain skilled labor. And the thing to emphasize there is skilled labor, that is labor that can meet the conditions and needs that they have, not just any person, but people that have the necessary skills and training. And 73% of those surveyed experienced some kind of recruitment challenge. The second challenge for business success is government red tape. And I read a survey recently that said that only 13% of Canadian CEOs feel that the level of bureaucracy and regulatory matters to deal with in Canada is satisfactory. The other 87% had deep concerns in the area, and I'm actually surprised it wasn't more than that. Personal taxation levels were also noted as one of their big challenges for success, which I think ties in quite nicely to the labor challenges people are experiencing. So CPAs were also asked to identify their top 3 economic issues, if I had to generalize. And the first one, no surprise here, housing prices. The second one is barriers to trade. And this here really popped up from last year. And again, no big surprise given the NAFTA discussions. Tara spoke here about the US-China trade battle. So that was the second most. And the third most was the current value of the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. And obviously we've seen the Canadian dollar really slip in the last while due to a number of factors, including low interest rates relative to what we're seeing happening globally, as well as uncertainty respecting NAFTA. And that's impacting the value of the Canadian dollar. It's projected that it could rebound if we're able to come to ground with an agreement on NAFTA, but right now it is certainly number 3 on the list of top economic issues. So a lot to digest and a lot of change going on around us in a number of different ways. So what are we doing as a profession? Well, for the last number of years, we've been working on ways to help our CPA members, to help make sure that CPA students have the right kinds of training, but also to make sure that we are equipping CPAs and the public to be able to make their businesses successful. We want to see all of society be successful. And so it's definitely true that the only constant is change. So we need to make sure that businesses are equipped to be able to manage change and turn challenges into opportunities. And to do that, I think it all boils down to being resilient and adaptable in this world of constant change. So CPAs developed this Drivers of Change program. And what we did was boil down into different pillars, the different kinds of change that businesses can experience: economic, environmental, technological, societal, and geopolitical. And within each, we have also a workbook that people can work through when working with their businesses to make sure that they canvass the types of questions that they ought to consider to make sure that they are, to the extent they can, anticipating change in these areas and responding accordingly. So let's go through each of these quickly. The first one is economic, and I gave a bunch of economic data at the beginning, but I can tell you that broadly speaking, in terms of how Canada compares globally, Canada has been assessed at number 14 out of 137 in terms of global competitiveness by the World Economic Forum. So that's pretty decent. And more particularly, they have a number of different areas that they look at closely. Canada ranked 7th overall in terms of efficiency enablers, things like education, technology, ability to change the labor market. So that's good. And you see that really being a priority of the Canadian government. We have the investment in terms of the Supercluster Initiative and other areas that they're trying to really promote. That said, we have to ask ourselves, against the context we talked about before, with labor market shortages, the need to have higher educated workforce participants, is this sustainable? Are we going to be able to keep it up? So the second area of change is environmental. And it's been well recognized, including by the Bank of Canada, that both climate change as well as environmental factors will have a deep material impact on the economy. And environmental factors is one area that's really very closely interconnected to the other drivers of change that I talked about. For example, if there's a flood, that could lead to a mass migration, or that could lead to a conflict. So environmental factors is the one area that's seen as really being an area that interconnects with and really drives some of the other areas of change. I can share another stat with you. The Canadian government has projected that if Canada doesn't do anything about climate change, it could cost Canada $21 billion or as high as $43 billion if steps aren't taken by the year 2050. So really a very, very significant cost. But the one shining star here is what kind of opportunities Canada can create from this. And at the Globe conference several years ago, Michael Porter was here, and he really singled out Canada as being well positioned to be able to turn environmental challenges into those opportunities by being a leader in terms of environmental technologies. And so that, to me, is something that Canadian businesses can really seize. Technology, another area of significant change. Clearly, people say we're in the fourth industrial revolution with cheap data, the third revolution having been digital. This has enabled various industries to experience exponential growth and companies within those industries. So people need to be ahead of the curve and really be able to anticipate what's necessary. In my industry, professional accounting, I can tell you that there's 94% probability that the traditional work that has been done in the past by accountants and auditors will be replaced and will be automated. 94%. That said, if you do surveys of CEOs, which I've done, 100% of them think that we will need just as many, if not more, CPAs to be able to understand, interpret that data, to just apply their skills differently, to be able to be that continuing source of trust in terms of the value of data. So all this means that the work won't go away, it just will change, and we need to make sure that we are equipping members with the right level of competencies to be able to function in that kind of environment. Fourth area of change we're seeing is societal. The Canadian population is growing about 1% per year, and Canada stands alone in terms of that population growth. Other countries are not experiencing that level of growth. About 2/3 of that growth is coming from immigration. And of course, we're also seeing a change in terms of the demographics with an aging population. By 2036, it is projected that about 25% of our population will be over the age of 65. So really, we'll have a very, very different looking population by the year 2036. And so what does that mean in terms of business? Well, it means that the workforce profile will change. It means we'll have a very multicultural and a very multi-generational workforce. And as a consequence, we need to make sure that we are being inclusive, building that inclusive corporate culture that allows people to share information, to work together, to encourage collaboration, to allow those types of workforce profiles to work together as one. So it will be certainly a challenge for human resource management to be able to navigate in that kind of world. Geopolitical is the last driver of change that we have singled out, and this is obviously the one that has seen quite a bit of activity most recently. Going back to 2017 in Davos, the World Economic Forum, there they had a theme of uncertainty. That was back in 2017, and we've seen nothing but uncertainty since. Obviously, a lot of activity out of the US impacting Canada in terms of NAFTA discussions, again, tariffs, Brexit. There's so many different areas where we are seeing change, and that is impacting businesses very profoundly. And for the first time in a long time, businesses have had to become experts in terms of the political situation around themselves, because it's going to impact their supply chains, their customers, even safety of their workforce. So it's become a very, very high profile item. So again, those are the 5 buckets of change, and we have developed a program that allows people to kind of work through these different areas to really ask themselves the right kinds of questions that they need to inform strategy for their own businesses. Most recently, we've launched something else called the Foresight Project, and this is called Reimagining the Profession. And what it is a series of roundtables, both live as well as a digital interface where people can engage in that conversation online and through a dashboard online that's powered by AI, so we can distill down what people's thoughts are. And it's really asking people to project 10 years into the future and anticipate challenges to be faced by the profession, as well as what an ideal state would be. And to get really a broad range of views from all sorts of stakeholders, not just members, but we want to hear from the public, the government. We want to hear from everyone to understand what their perceptions are, so we can make sure that we are positioning and equipping the chartered professional accountants to be able to respond appropriately, and to make sure that society has the right level of skills that we can possibly help to produce, to make sure that businesses are equipped with the right types of resources for them to respond to all these different categories of change. So that's going on currently, and if you are interested, if you Google CPA Canada Foresight, you'll be able to go into what's called the Soapbox discussion app and participate in that conversation. So I've shared with you some economic data, the impressions that CPAs have about where the economy is going, and I've also shared some of the new initiatives by the profession to try to make sure that the members, as well as the public, is equipped to make sure that businesses are strong and powerful going forward.
Thank you so much, Laura. Those were some great visuals and easy to understand for non-numbers people like me. The way we like to thank our speakers here at Rotary is by making a donation to the End the Polio campaign so that 250 children will be immunized against polio. Rotary has been working to eradicate polio since the 1980s, and we hope that in the next few years we'll be able to declare it finished, just like smallpox, working with the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We do have a few minutes for Q&A, so Joe will monitor the microphone if you, is that okay?
Absolutely, thank you.
Great. Anybody back here? Okay, I've got strict orders. I hold the mic, you ask the question.
Very quickly, the evolution of the profession, the certification and training process, we didn't touch on it, but if you need so many students and new CPAs, what is the process for somebody to get into the profession?
Yes, thank you. And it is certainly a priority. We're working on a labor market study right now to understand how to make sure we get the right numbers and the right qualified people into the profession. So we're working on that from both a quantitative and qualitative perspective. But generally speaking, to become a CPA, you need to have an undergraduate degree. You need to have completed a number of courses, including 6 different courses that are prescribed. You need to finish the common final exam, the CP. And you need to obtain 30 months of experience. So broadly speaking, that's it.
And this is an inquisitive table.
This might be a little bit loaded, but to what degree do you attribute your downward projection on GDP to the policies of this new government, be it taxation or otherwise?
So that is indeed a loaded question. I'll simply say that I think that this year's dampening in terms of economic performance is from a whole range of issues. Some of it will have resulted from political policies, no question, but we're also functioning in a very dynamic international environment, and so it's a combination of a whole host of factors.
And we got another one.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm not sure how to phrase this exactly, but what I didn't see in your presentation, which is impacting British Columbians, small business, and probably our government, are these disruptive technologies that aren't typically paying taxes into our community. And I'm wondering what the CPA stance and if there is some initiative in that conversation with your members as well as with governments.
So we saw the report from David Eby about a couple months ago concerning the underground economy and some of the initiatives that the government is pursuing, and the CPA organization absolutely supports that work. The CPAs want to make sure that we have strong public markets that the public is confident in. So we want everything to be above board, and any initiatives in those areas are 100% things that we support.
Great.
Thanks for a great presentation, Lauri. It's just kind of a stupid question, but what the heck. In terms of your membership, a certain number are working in public practice for government and not-for-profits and so on, and many others are working in the private sector. do you find a difference, when you do the research, do you find a difference in the perception of the respondents based on variables such as that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And about 80% of our members are in industry, only 20% are in public practice, which is interesting and something most people don't realize. But also what we find is those in public practice usually work very closely with those in industry, like as clients. And so their perceptions are not materially different.
Great. Wonderful. One more.
In regards to the affordability here, is one option for, and if the employer isn't able to maybe pay more, or they know that their employee is going to get taxed higher by paying more, can they not offset that in some way by offering other benefits or subsidizing some of their housing or something like that, so that their employees still find it worthwhile to be gainfully employed for them long term, but they're not being hit with an extra tax bill?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And those other types of initiatives are things I know that different businesses canvass. That said, those types of other incentives, whether they be subsidized housing or medical care or what have you, it's going to be a taxable benefit. So it still will be taxed at the same rate.
One more.
Do you have any idea what a 10-year bond rate might be?
If I knew that, I would be rich.
Well, Mr. President, it's back to you, and I really hope this might now say.
Thank you, Lauri, and thank you for the great questions. We have numerous accountants in our club. All right, so for next week's program, we have Vancouver author Aaron Chapman coming to present. He has written numerous books, one on the history of the Commodore Ballroom, which of course everybody here knows about. And there's a new one out about the Penthouse Cabaret. Some of you might know about that one. And I'm going to show the 2-minute trailer for the Studio 54 movie next week as well. So your discretion may be advised, but if you want a sneak preview, check it out at home. Now, if you'd please rise, I'd like to do a toast. And I'd like to adjourn today's meeting with the toast to peace and prosperity. Have a great week.